tells you one of the conversations that one has. Is it technology? Is it communities? Are they in conversation? And I hope that this morning we will be looking at some of these issues in conversation with each other and in conversation with and by the individuals that are involved within this process. So I would like to welcome you all. My name is Edward, Professor Edward Chilumira. I'm the director for STIAS, been director since 2019, and it's one of the greatest pleasures and privilege to be in that position of leading this institute that prides itself on the motto of a creative space for the mind. So as long as you're creative, we will have you here. So you just have to say, I am creative, and I'll be satisfied. So even if at the end of the day, I don't see what you created, I know that you created something that will come to fruition at some stage. So I really want to encourage us to find ourselves in that space of creativity, in that space of sharing, in that space of common humanity, and begin to address issues that are topical, that may even look like they're crises, but that they're only presenting themselves as crises, but they've lived with us for all humanity. And that we take a step back from the crisis to look at the pathways to those intended crises. So I hope that we reflect on the topic of this workshop from the position of stepping back and say, why, how, where, from, and then see how then we can address it for the future. They always say that the answer for now was already made. The answer that we're making now is for the future. It's very difficult to have the answer for now. Otherwise we will not be 20, 30, 40, 50-year-olds and 60-year-olds. So I really invite you to this space. As some of you, it's the first time to come to STIAS. STIAS celebrated its 25th year last year. It's part of 10 institutes for advanced study. We still pride ourselves as the only institute of this kind in the Southern Hemisphere, not in Africa only. But it's really a space where Africa becomes hope that we can do that. We build this on the fellowship program, but that we're also now having these initiatives that then help us to work with our partners to address topical issues, but bringing various disciplines and voices to this. And so on that note, I also want to introduce the partners for this STIAS Boston University Center for Displacement and Schooner Foundation that are putting this together. This is our second workshop, and we hope that this is going to be a continuous journey. We started broadly looking at migration corridors, and I think now we're beginning to narrow on specific aspects. So I want to introduce my colleague and friend and brother, Muhammad Zamani, who is the director for the Center on Forced Displacement at Boston University. So next time you're walking on Boston streets, you're probably going to bump into him. If he's not some other place or some, and then also to introduce Julia, who kindly supports through the Schooner Foundation so we're absolutely grateful for the confidence to begin with that we can do something. And I think that when you look at the people here, we definitely will and can do something. So I invite you to really The interesting thing is like, this is like those no person's land where you can discuss everything. At Makerere, we used to have a space we called the Freedom Square, just next to the main building. Even in the really terrible days of Idi Amin, that was the space where you went and criticized everybody, including him, and you wouldn't get any problem. But if you stepped out, then it would be something else. So we would like to create these spaces where people can breathe and can interrogate themselves. They can, not just about what is happening out there, but yourself to reflect on why am I doing what I'm doing and how does it contribute to the topical issue that we have. So thank you for taking this time, and I'll ask Muhammad to also say opening remarks. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Edward, for that wonderful introduction to the space. This is an extraordinary space of creativity, of intellectual pursuit, of understanding. As you can see, this is the second workshop. The idea is that this will become a permanent thing every year, but also during the year, we'll have the opportunity to learn from each other. Before I start, I want to thank a bunch of people who have been extraordinary supporters. I want to start first with my very, very dear friend, colleague, and in many ways mentor, Julia Pettengill, who sort of has been there for many years for me in terms of enabling me to do the kinds of crazy things that I come up with and sort of really supporting them in extraordinary ways. The idea for this workshop started a couple of years ago. Julia and I were talking, as we often do, and the notion that how do we really take a stock of global challenges in ways that are intellectually rich, honest, and in places where it matters. Then Julia happened to be in Cape Town, came to see Edward, and then of course, once you come here, there is no reason to do it anywhere else, right? So it just becomes an automatic thing here. So great, thanks to Julia and to Schooner Foundation. I've had the chance to work with Edward on several things, and he's an extraordinary human being. He's kind, he's thoughtful, he is sort of brilliant to the point of being scary, and I just sort of really enjoy these things, not just in South Africa, in the United States, in Pakistan, in the Middle East. These are complicated things. These are emotionally, politically charged topics. So we want to sort of create a space that is comfortable to be able to have honest dialogue with respect, with understanding, and being even challenged ourselves, right? So I hope that some of my own notions are going to be challenged by sort of evidence, by data, by perspective, and I hope that is going to be the case for others as well. I live in a country where polarization is extreme on both ends. There is tremendous intolerance on the left and the right, and the conversation that should be happening is not happening. And the fact that STIAS allows for that space to exist is just an extraordinary privilege, absolutely extraordinary privilege that we can have this kind of conversation and be judged by the strength of our arguments, not by what we look like, what party, or what country we come from. And I think that's important. So that's why the design of this is a workshop. It is not a conference. It is not of that nature. The second thing is, the second aspect of design that I hope you will appreciate is that you will meet people who come from very different backgrounds. My degrees are in chemistry, and I work on these kinds of things. There are people who are sociologists. There are people who are anthropologists. There are people who are philosophers. And we hope that we are able to have these conversations because the issue of forced displacement is one that touches all of these things. So I work on emergence of diseases in forced displacement situations, right? The issue of infectious diseases in refugee camps, the result of conflict. Somebody else may be working on issues of ethics. What does it mean to take care of a migrant? Who's responsible? Who's responsible for entitlements? And so on and so forth there. And so there's so many different topics here. So we have lawyers or legal scholars, we have consultants, we have practitioners, we have sociologists and historians, and we really want to do it that way. That is inherently deliberate. It is not the result of a Google search to find 10 people. It is deliberate to find people who are really bringing in that perspective. And so that's the second aspect of this design. The third aspect is that the agenda is very, very loose, and that is in the spirit of creativity, that we don't want, at the end of the day, some kind of a final product. If it emerges, great. If it doesn't, that's fine. Last year, when we had this conversation, papers came out, research grants came out, fellowships came out from the conversations that emerged, not because we had designed it to be that way. And we want to keep it that way. In a world, I come from a Department of Engineering where things are already predefined. This is the product that I want at the end. And I want to push back against it. I actually want to challenge it. I don't want a product that I've already designed. I want the product to emerge from the conversation over lunch and coffee, and maybe a product that will emerge 6 months from now, right? So that's the goal here, is to be able to allow for this space in a world that has become so technocentric and so sort of driven by these kinds of things, to take a step back and ask hard questions and let us take time to investigate those. And if it happens in a month, great. If it happens in 5 years, that's perfectly fine as well. We need to create those spaces where there is no push to create a final product. At the same time, we also need to recognize that there is a challenge here and now, right? So there are two very, very different kinds of things. One is being and having the privilege of being in an academic space where you can take a stock of the things. On the other hand, there are people who are hurting in this country, in the country that I live in the country that I grew up in the country that I work in. Here, right? Should we have more artists here, more journalists, more historians, more policymakers? Who should be here in these conversations? So when we do this in June of 2027, who else needs to be at the table? And do that with a sense that this is something that belongs to all of us. We need to be thinking about this. So I had a wonderful conversation with Julia and Edward, and Isla was there last night as well, about how do you institutionalize this. We want to create an institution here, rooted in STIAS, but with sort of partnership from other places, certainly the center that I'm privileged to direct and Schooner Foundation, and we want to make it a long-term thing. But we can only do it if there are good ideas constantly coming from all of you. What else needs to be here, right? Should we have an oral historian? Should we have an investigative journalist? Should we have lawyers and jurists and other kinds of artists? So please do share your ideas with me, with Edward, with Julia, with others as well. So I want to sort of end here. The two panels that we have, and I think we may have one less person because of travel issues, are designed to be overarching. People will see whatever, people will say whatever they want to say. This is not a place where people will be told if they have presentations, great. If there's something they want to share, great. And the idea is my colleagues, 3 or 4 people, will speak for about, 5 or 10 minutes, and then we will have a conversation. And that is by design again, right? We want to be able to take stock. So the 2 panels, one is to take a stock on migration corridors in Africa, and community support. What is it that we know? What is it that we don't know? What is it that we should be thinking about? All of those kinds of things. And the second one is, of course, the role of technology, good or bad, and how it's shaping migration, how it's shaping migration research, how it's impacting communities in positive ways and in negative ways as well. And as I said, the idea here is that I don't want to tell people this is the thing that you should be speaking about. I've sent some overarching questions and people will choose as they see fit, or they may choose something else as well. and here's an opportunity for me to learn from all of them, and I hope you as well. So with that, thank you very much, and thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. When you said that you want to have STIAS to hold this for eternity, I was just thinking about my contract. But I guess I have a few years to anchor it, and then it can run on its own. I would like to call upon the panelists for the first panel. So if I can ask Marius, Ole, Leah, and Victorine to come over here. And I think depending on how each one of them wants to present, it's not a problem during your presentation for the panelists to move over so that they can see the screen, and then they can get back for the question and answers.
I think Victorine isn't here because of some travel issues, so we have 3 colleagues instead of 4.
Okay, so, and what I ask is that each one of the panel just introduce themselves briefly, and then we get into we dive into the conversation. Last night I was reading a keynote that was given 2 days ago at MIASAT, the Marian Institute for Advanced Study in Ghana, in Accra. They're having a meeting there. And one of the things that, there was a line that was interesting in that keynote presentation that said that we need a commitment to shared humanity, the highly differentiated ethical task, the embodiment of solidarity of incomplete, and indeed this dismantling of the complete gentleman fallacy. And it pointed me to the fact that when we're looking at communities, they defy the completeness, and they are receiving people passing through. Every time you're driving to Cape Agulhas in South Africa, you're already thinking about the stops that you're going to make to have coffee, to have tea, and those stops must be there, must be prepared to receive you, to have coffee in their coffee stations. But a lot of times we don't think about those stops and how they're part and parcel of the conversation of the traveler. So I welcome the panelists to reflect from their understanding and experience of these issues and many issues as we look at the first session, and then we hope that we'll have time for discussion. So may I start with Marius, maybe? Since you sat near me, so I can start with you.
So this is just the introduction, I believe, of us all. Yeah, thank you very much. It's always an exciting privilege to be here at STIAS. I've been here as a research fellow on 2 occasions, co-leading a work on migration vulnerability and social protection, and that led to a publication. And as I told some of the colleagues this morning, this is a very special institute, one of its kind in the world. It's not just welcoming, it's accommodating, and the space that it gives and creates for people to work on very important issues. So thank you for the invitation to Edward and also the others, and wonderful also to meet our other colleagues from the other institutions. I met Howard this morning. So I've been working on the space of migration probably for the last 3 decades, if not longer, of my life. Much of my focus has been on Africa, not exclusively, but probably the majority of it. I've worked with African institutions, African Union institutions, the labor context and also social protection. I've worked with several international organizations, ILO, UNDP, EU, and others, with governments and the like. The core of my work has been to focus on normative developments. So quite a range of normative frameworks have been established last 10 years in Africa, and I had the privilege to be involved with some of them. But also policy formulation, policy implementation, policy analysis, review, program assessment. This is ongoing work. The area is just so huge, the issue is so prevalent, so important. And the answers, even if they're not final, Howard, they are at least extremely important for the continent to move ahead. Thank you for, and I'm holding a number of academic positions. Thank you.
We're just doing introductions now. Great. Hi, everyone. Lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me to speak. My name is Orly Stern. I work as a freelance consultant, and I have for the last almost 20 years, consulting to a range of international organizations on a number of different issues, but a lot of my work relates to women, human rights, and war and armed conflict. So I do pieces of research, I do advisory work for a range of different international clients, but women and war has been a key theme in my work, and women and displacement, and so my comments will be on the gendered aspects of migration, which is very much where my work has come from. I look forward to presenting in a few minutes. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Leah Koskamaki. I'm a senior lecturer at the Institute for Social Development at the University of the Western Cape. And I also coordinate UWC's Migration and Mobility's Interdisciplinary Collective in Africa and MICA. And part of MICA, what we've been doing at UWC is bringing together colleagues from various departments and disciplines to discuss the important issues around migration or mobilities in plural. And so I'm very looking forward to the discussion today, and thank you for inviting.
Thank you very much. I think we'll just go straight into the conversation, and you can see the breadth of perspectives that are being brought here. I think that also after the presentation, we'll have a chance to interact with our colleagues. So what I want to propose is that each one of you, speaks to this topic, and then we can see how we go on. And maybe I can start with the neighbor now at UWC. It's not very.
Oh, okay. Is it on? Okay. Okay, thank you. I'm looking at Mohammed here because I told him I didn't really prepare any formal presentation today. But thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak in this context. So one of the things that colleagues and I have been working on, which I think will be relevant for what we're going to be discussing later, is this topic of migrant solidarity, because at least in the South African context where we've been doing research, as we know, there's a lot of xenophobia, and as we see right now in the media and what's happening on the ground is that it's very horrifying what's happening in the spaces where migrants are being threatened and driven out of their homes. And so one of the things that we've been looking at is, well, what are the spaces in which hospitality and solidarity are enacted in urban contexts? And of course, we know that Cape Town and so in a comparative context, you might see, even in the US, sanctuary cities, or in Europe and other places. So we are trying to think about, well, what is happening here in terms of offering sanctuary or support to migrant communities. And as we know, municipal solidarity is quite weak in these contexts. And we know that politics and political parties play a role in a lot of these mobilizations. And then, on the other hand, civic solidarity, which is how civil society and community organizations can come together to support, is also plays a very important role. But even then, there's been research by Kura Venyoro and others that has looked at how, and Lauren Landau, that has looked at how civil society organizations are underfunded, and a lot of their work, it ends up fragmenting some of their objectives. And even as we see in the media now, one thing that I've noticed is that there's this accusation around what they call foreign-funded NGOs who are supporting the migrant communities. And so I think there's also about a politics about who's supporting who. And so these are other things that I think we need to think about when we think about solidarity. And then, of course, there's solidarity and sanctuary in faith-based organizations and churches that often give refuge when there's these particular outbreaks, or where migrant communities can go and get support. And finally, there's these internal kinds of solidarity, which go back to the earlier literature on ethnic social capital, or the way that communities can come together to support one another. And I think all of these themes, maybe they'll arise in the conversations today, because if we're thinking about technology and healthcare, how is it that people who have become different forms of irregularity in their lives, whether it's the legal or social or economic, how do these irregularized migrants try to get access to services and resources? And usually in the news we see, Operation Dudula and these other organizations blocking people from getting access to healthcare due to the March and those kinds of things. And at the end of the day, what I've seen, and when I'm doing research, because the research I do with different communities, most of my research is with the Bangladeshi, Pakistani, and Indian migrant communities in Cape Town. And if you speak to any of them, they will say their biggest problem is documentation. And one thing that I think we need to keep looking at is how documentation is discussed in the space of xenophobia, whether it has to do with medical xenophobia, which is a term that my colleague Godfrey Tawadzera has been using now for some time. But if we think about documentation, there's this idea that, these marches aren't xenophobic. We're anti-illegal migrants. But as we know that, as all of us who work on this area know, that this idea of illegalized migrants is so, people are not aware about how people are dealing with documentation, the kind of permits they get, the kind of bureaucratic obstacles they face. And at the end of the day, what we see is that it doesn't even matter if you have a permit. They're going to say, maybe your permit is fake, or maybe there'll still be other forms of discrimination or xenophobia in the space of healthcare access. So I don't know how long I'm supposed to speak, but this is one of the areas where I'm doing research, and where I think that we can continue to talk about what are the different ways, both informal and formal, that we can think about migrant communities and their access to healthcare. And then, of course, what you'll be talking about in the second panel, the role of technology in that, how people access those things, and how these digital platforms might actually exclude people who rely on the informality of these systems, or whether it will help them to get better services. So that's it. I don't know how long I'm supposed to.
No, I think that's fine. I think as we mentioned at the beginning, it's a conversation. Okay. So, and there are quite a number of things that you're bringing out, the issue of spaces and the migrant solidarity and other elements that we need to touch on. And so we roll into the second commentary, and then, yeah.
Great. Well, as I said, I'm going to focus my talk today on gendered aspects, or on the experiences of female migrants, because I think that that's a topic which is often overlooked to some extent. I think it's really interesting to look at female migrants because they suffer so many of the same vulnerabilities as all migrants, but then they suffer a whole unique range of vulnerabilities just on the basis of their gender, which makes it particularly important to look at. They suffer intersecting forms of discrimination, discrimination on the basis of their gender, as well as discrimination on the basis of migration status, nationality, ethnicity, etc., etc. And these types of discrimination compound each other. And so you find female migrants as this extremely, extremely vulnerable group. I'm going to start off with the really heavy stuff, and that's the topic of gender-based violence, which I think is such a huge part of the experience of migrants. A lot of what I'm going to talk about now is about women on the move during their journeys, but what I'm saying is not exclusive to migrants on the move. I think that one can say that gender-based violence and sexual violence is endemic in the experience of female migrants. It's so common that it's not something which is exceptional. It's really something which is a core part of the experiences of poor women on the move, particularly in Africa. I'll give you some examples of how this plays out. So one of the things is called sex for passage. And sometimes sex is taken as payment for bribes or for transportation along migrants' routes. And as migrants need to move to the next place and to the next place, particularly women run out of money. Women have lesser access to resources, and sex is a way in which passage is paid for. And it's an extremely common form of payment for passage as migrants go along their route. Smugglers use sexual violence against migrants. So you see examples where smugglers use rape women to discipline them, to punish them, to keep other migrants in check. So they'll sexually violate a woman in order to show everyone else in the group that they mean business and that nobody should misbehave. They do it sometimes just to prove their power and their racism and their power and their authority in these situations. There's risks to women at borders. Borders are an extremely dangerous place for women. Borders are very male-dominated spaces, many more men working than women. And there's case after case and country after country, report after report, of women being sexually violated at borders. So, for example, at the border between DRC and Rwanda, women complain that the searches by male border guards often denigrate into full-out groping and assaults. On Eastern Congo's border, rape by border officials is said to become very, very common, and women interviewed talk about letting themselves be raped in order to cross the borders. That's what they need to do. Same on the borders between Rwanda, Burundi, DRC, Uganda. You've got reports of this happening. It's not only border officials that pose a risk to women. You've also got risks coming from police and from members of militias at borders as well. And so the risks at borders push women towards unregulated crossings, but unfortunately there they have the same problems as well. At unregulated crossings, women are at risk of violence from facilitators, from smugglers, and also from official border guards, official immigration personnel who catch them and subject them to sexual violence in exchange for not It's not only at borders, it's also on the road, at roadblocks, in public transport, everywhere along the movement. And the poor road infrastructure and high travel costs and all of this just compound these problems. And the problems are even compounded even further when women are traveling at night. So yeah, that's just a flavor. Unfortunately, sexual violence is just part of the process of traveling for female migrants. Another topic that I want to talk about is females' childcare obligations. It's often women who will travel with children and who will be responsible for childcare as they travel, and that very much shapes the experience of migration. And so you find that whether they're moving or whether they're in a city or wherever they are, women are often the ones who are left with this childcare obligation. Sometimes smugglers separate women from their children in order to control female migrants, and they leave the children with other female migrants who have to look after them. Often because of care norms in our society, because of patriarchal care norms, women have to take care of whoever needs caring for, whether they be the elderly or the injured or the sick. And so along migration corridors, women are the ones who are responsible for care, even of people who are not their own relatives or friends, just people who are needing care. This often falls to women, who are therefore left with less capability to look after themselves because they find themselves in a care responsibility position over others. Thinking about female migrants' work, many female migrants find themselves in informal work, domestic work, care work, agriculture, and service sector jobs. And these are often jobs where labor protections are particularly weak. And so women find themselves very, very vulnerable to exploitation in sectors where the protections are weak. Coming back to the issue of documentation, which you raised, documentation is another area where women are disproportionately challenged. Women are less likely than men to have proper documentation. Often women have to flee their homes without documentation. The documentation is held by their husbands. Their documentation is held by traffickers, partners, employers, smugglers, people who are not the women themselves. And so women find themselves with a lack of documentation. And unfortunately, as we know, a lack of documentation means often that you can't access other services, including healthcare, banking, employment, housing, justice. So a lack of documentation is the first vulnerability, which then leads to other vulnerabilities. Women suffer from economic exclusion. They frequently have less access to savings, credit, bank accounts, and financial networks. They often also earn less than male migrants, which means that they have less opportunity to replenish their funds when their funds have run out. And this economic vulnerability is then introduces other vulnerabilities. So when people are economically vulnerable, it opens the way for exploitative relationships, transactional sex, labor exploitation, and sexual exploitation. And many interventions focus on protection, but they forget to look at this issue of economic empowerment of women, female migrants. I think that I've been talking a lot about the vulnerabilities of female migrants, but I think it's important just to say that we mustn't only frame them as a vulnerable group. They're also a really important group of actors. So women are traders, entrepreneurs, they're workers, they're heads of households, they're community leaders. Women's migration often sustains families and local economies through remittances and commerce. And I think that we have to remember that policies and support needs to not only focus on women in this position as vulnerable victims, but also in the position of agents who really are playing an essential role, female migrants, I mean. And just one final point on this section is to say that one of the problems is that migration policies are often gender neutral. They look at everyone as being the same, and they often look at everyone as being the same as the male migrant. And so often policies are not looking at the unique experiences of female migrants along the migration routes. The next question that I was asked to just think about is like, what has worked and what has not worked? So what has worked, which has been useful, is slowly we're seeing increased recognition of gender-based violence as being an important part of migration, of an important part of forced displacement, and of humanitarian operations generally. And so we're seeing this issue of sexual violence getting more attention, although there's still a huge amount of work that needs to happen there. We're seeing more research that looks at the gendered experiences of migration. So more and more we're cracking open this idea of the migrant as being like the male migrant, and we're starting to see more research that unpacks the experiences of women. And we're starting to see more legal and policy frameworks strengthening against trafficking, exploitation, and violence against women, which is good. What's not working? Still, overridingly, we see migrants being looked at as one group and the group representing male migrants. That's still the norm. So services are often considered without considering women's care obligations. So if you're offering services to migrants that only are open during certain hours and women have to work during those hours or have to care for children during those hours, it can make it extremely difficult for female migrants to access services. So that's something to think about. Responses to female migrants are often very fragmented. And so women have to go for the assistance they need to a number of different service providers, each who offer different barriers and different challenges, and that can make it extremely difficult for women to access services. And too little attention has been paid to the economic empowerment of female migrants, and I think that's really an important place we need to be looking. And then the final question I was asked to present on is, what are some of the pressing issues in providing services that have not received adequate attention? I think that the issue of providing sexual and reproductive health care to female migrants is really important. It hasn't received enough attention, particularly to women who are undocumented or women living in informal settings. It can be extremely hard to access these services. And this is really important given how dominant the experiences of sexual violence and dominant the experience of pregnancy might be in the experiences of female migrants. So that's really a priority area. Childcare barriers, I've mentioned that, but women's responsibilities, childcare responsibilities can prevent them from accessing so many other services. And yet these barriers are seldom considered when people are designing services. So this is something that really needs to be considered when designing services of a number of types. Psychosocial support, the experiences of female migrants can be extremely, extremely traumatic, and they have a huge need for psychosocial support, and that's something which I think a great deal of attention is needed. It's provided in some settings, but it's often not provided sufficiently. There's a need to also think about justice for female migrants. I've spoken about the types of abuse they face, but I think it's important to think about if for a female migrant to report abuse of any sort exposes them to detention, to deportation, to a loss of income, to retaliation by employers, to retaliation by smugglers, to retaliation by abusive partners. And so we really need to recognize that just because there are reporting mechanisms available, they're not necessarily available to female migrants. And so there's really a need to think through justice from the perspective of female migrants and think about how to make sure that it's actually usable by female migrants. Because at the moment, what you see is most types of abuse that female migrants face just falling under the radar and them not reporting it. My talk has mentioned, and so really I need to think through services and assistance for those who are in transit. And then finally, the need to still plug in some of the data gaps. You know, there's really a big need for more research in this area. We still don't know so much about the experiences of the gendered side of migration. And so yeah, a real push towards more research in this area I think is super helpful. Great, thanks so much, and I look forward to answering any questions when the session is done.
Thank you, and thank you for my two colleagues who have done so much of the heavy lifting already, because these are actually some of the pertinent issues I thought also to raise. Yes, as you probably have heard, we have been given 3 questions. So what I did was to take kind of, on the one hand, a broad perspective of what are the, on an overarching level, what are the issues of relevance in this continent in relation to those 3 questions. But then also to drill down into some of the details. Now, we don't have time now to discuss all of this. So for the moment, I'm just going to touch on some of the issues, but I want to drill down into some very critical areas, which I think we need, more appropriate responses also from the perspective of the research community. Because I don't think that always as researchers we do enough, to be honest. In fact, later on, one of the questions, what do we see as problems in the research space? Just at a high level, I've identified about 17 critical research issues in migration, which I don't think are being given proper attention to, in my view. And I say this based on my own experience over many years. The first question concerns the current challenges facing migrants in Africa. So from a high-level perspective, if there's time later on, we can drill down into detail, of course, the treatment of migrant workers, not just as xenophobia, but mistrust. I mean, what's currently happening in this country, what's happening in Tunisia, and a few other countries in the continent, not even talking about Europe, vis-a-vis African migrants. I mean, it's really heartbreaking. The second high-level issue in this regard, challenge, is actually recruitment practices and frameworks. I mean, the gaps, they are huge, and unless we fill those gaps properly, from all sorts of perspectives, we're going to have a continuation of the scenarios that we are seeing in terms of how migrant workers are being abused and treated or maltreated in the continent. Large-scale human trafficking and smuggling, it partly ties in with what Oli has suggested. I mean, there are just so many issues there. There are responses in the continent, increasingly improvements in the continent, even at a national level, but we are far from where we should be for reasons we can discuss at a later stage. Then I had a list of issues around gender-based discrimination, disadvantage, disparate treatment. I'm not going to dwell into this. I think she has done a marvelous job. Orly, but all that I do want to say in this regard, if you look at the system responses, they are inadequate. And I see this also in one of the areas I work on, is social protection responses to gender discrimination in relation to migrants in particular. The countries do not really appreciate, firstly, what the issues are, secondly, less how to respond to this. The other main issue in this area is limited family reunification arrangements. It's not easy for families to unify or reunify with the male and sometimes female migrant workers elsewhere in the continent for all sorts of visa restrictions issues. Weak return and reintegration frameworks, and I say this despite the fact that at the AU level, quite a range of measures have already been adopted to look at return and reintegration. There's very little happening of this on the ground in our countries. Then very important issues, limited country of origin support, despite weak protection and disadvantaged status of migrants and migrant workers in countries of destination. It's only now that we see some measures being taken. The Kenyan government has just worked on a migrant welfare program for their own citizens abroad. I think it's the first official such program in the continent. Other countries have a patchwork of measures. And here the guidance is there. The African Union level, we have a full set of guidelines on how to deal with this topic. There are implementation tools that have been developed by the African Union on what countries could and should do. But hopefully we'll get a better response in future. And finally, in this regard, something I will touch on in a moment more detail, the climate change and displaced populations, displaced as a result of conflict and climate change. It's a huge issue. I'll come back to that now. The second question concerned what has worked and what not. When it comes to community support, legal framework, research and policy, and again, I'm just going to highlight a few issues and maybe drill down on one or two. In terms of community support, depends, of course, on how you see community support, but let me just say this for the moment. Homegrown community support is a very interesting and important topic. We see it in the area of social protection provisioning by people themselves. This includes mutuality-based arrangements, faith-based arrangements. There are many of them in the continent. They contribute significantly to migrant economic survival, to social protection, social cohesion. But this is now important. From what I read and see happening or not happening in continents, their function and role remain under-researched and are not well integrated in official policy frameworks. It's a massive issue. Until recent governments have said we are not interested in what people do on their own in terms of coping mechanisms. That's the reality, are they? Then on the legal frameworks and policy context, a few remarks. The first is that with reference to Africa's rich tapestry of migration instruments and guiding frameworks, it's actually extraordinary what a continent, and even at the regional level, if you look at the RECs, what have been put in place. A vast array of migration instruments and guiding frameworks have been adopted in time. At times, listen to this, transcending even developments in other parts of the world. There's no other area in the world that has developed an IDP instrument like the Kampala Convention. Despite its shortcomings, it's a fantastic instrument. Fairly well ratified, not so well implemented yet by countries. There's this new guideline framework 2022 on migrant workers abroad. No other area in the world has done so yet. So we have a lot that we can use already in the continent. Displacement. Now this is, I hope you can understand just how important this is. In the first place, the blurred lines between forced and voluntary movement. When is it forced? When is it voluntary? You can't really say. The mixed nature of migration movements actually emphasize just what I've said. Policy and operational responses are currently overemphasized to this short-term human. On the other hand, preventive and labor market and societal integrated functions are less articulated and integrated, operating as silo interventions. I see this on a daily basis, and it's heartbreaking because we don't have a developmental mindset. And that's why we say a more developmental approach is called for with an emphasis on sustainable interventions, including sustainable social protection, also given the often protracted nature of climate change-induced displacement. Protracted nature, that's a reality out there. Then the so-called humanitarian development peace nexus, the HDP, requires a dedicated response, including social protection response, appreciation of the often present links between climate change-induced displacement and conflicts in areas affected by climate change events. There we have seen some very interesting recent research done, especially in the Horn of Africa, how the two are linked. And again, it's really heartbreaking to see the reality out there. On the other hand, conflict that may arise with host or local populations in the event of dedicated arrangements being rolled out to displaced populations in areas where they have moved to. It's a very delicate balance, and our countries are struggling to get that balance right. They know they have to respond. The response mostly humanitarian kind in nature, but you have anger, a lot of anger on the part of host communities because they think they don't get the same treatment. Then also insufficient developed normative and policy responses, including social protection responses to climate change effects, also in relation to climate change-induced displacement. Now, what I'm suggesting to you is that apart from the human rights responses and humanitarian approaches contained in some climate change and displacement instrument, there is very little in terms of specific, dedicated, normative responses, including normative social protection normative responses embedded in global, continental, and regional instruments, are largely absent. What a catastrophe. With some exception, climate-induced cross-border flight is hardly covered under refugee and migration instruments. It's just a whole gap out there, normatively speaking. Likewise, a dedicated internal displacement social protection contextualized normative framework is largely absent, doesn't exist. There is an over-reliance on donor community and international actors, largely humanitarian assistance support, yet there is a critical need for national ownership. And then finally, in this regard, is a lack of cross-sectoral and institutional coordinated approaches and responses involving also local government actors, civil society, and the private sector as well. Okay. Then I'm just going to mention the non-aligned and divergent immigration, trade, and social protection and labor law, legal and policy regimes. It's a nightmare, not just conceptually, but in practice as well. Support for migrants and migrant workers abroad, we covered that. Labor market, labor migration misalignment. Unless you get that right, you can't have proper, regular, if I could use the word, regular labor migration happening. It's a whole area which I'm not going to discuss in detail now. Weak bilateral labor migration arrangements. We have lots of bilateral labor agreements and MAUs, even within African countries, among African states, but also with countries abroad. But the moment you start analyzing those agreements, and that's been done by ILO, I've myself done quite a bit of work, these agreements are, with due respect, wholly inadequate. They do not comply with the international normative framework, including the Africa Union normative framework, with a specific framework, a set of guidelines developed by the AU, and there's massive work needs to be done. If we don't do that, we expose our migrant workers. And bilateral social security agreements, there are not many of them in the continent. They are very formal in nature. They don't really talk to the absolute key issues in terms of proper portability arrangements. At the continental, regional, and times also at bilateral levels. All over the continent, you have the free movement agreements. At the AU level, all of the RECs have either in their treaties or in their specific instruments, and even bilaterally. And yet, what's reality? Except with maybe ECOWAS to some extent, also EAC, it's lip service. There's no real political commitment. And with due respect, in this country, you see that actually happening. There's a SADC agreement. Okay, and then I'm also always through then on the research. I'm not going to mention those 17 research issues, but I do want to say this, that we have lack of proper academic research on policy interfacing, which is a separate discussion, great importance. And then the final question on pressing issues in providing legal, medical, community support. Just as one general remark for now, the compartmentalized treatment of different migrant categories. We have different frameworks for refugees, for asylum, well, partly asylum seekers, those covered by trade agreements or trade in services agreements, lack of a proper framework for migrants affected by climate change. Do we really need this kind of silo approaches? I would like to suggest. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marius, and thank you very much, Ole and Ayla, for the rich discussion and conversation. It's very interesting that, you know, there are quite a number of things that cut across the homogeneity with which we come to these terms. Also, refugees is homogeneous, it's the same. But at the same time, there's so much fragmentation that goes in when we now begin to look at them. You raised the question of vulnerabilities in the process of traveling. And I think that kind of ties in the initial discussion we had in the first workshop, that migrants, most times that the migrants are still traveling. They're just staying there for two days, 2 nights, 5 years, but they're still on a journey. And the way that we look at them is like as if they are staying. And so I think there are quite a number of issues that are coming. I'm intrigued about the Kampala Convention. And I think it's something that we might want to reflect on. And what are the good legal frameworks that are actually there? And have we looked at what is there and actually seems to be not only applicable to the African continent, but actually a trailblazer for the international regulation of individuals because I think we tend to look at what is not there and we probably miss some of this. So I think that is something that is critically important. The question also of borders that you talked about, and the assumption that borders are only crossing from Kenya to Uganda, but the borders are with us everywhere. We're crossing borders, entering STIAS. There's a border there. There's so many borders, and every time you are entering a community, there is a border. Do we see borders as part and parcel of, rather than waiting for them? Because if you can't catch them on the border between Zimbabwe and South Africa, there's a community they go to. That community becomes a border check. And so there's this whole problematization of this conversation that perhaps we need to pay attention to, that begins to take us away from the crisis to the endemic, and therefore saying, okay, we're not going to solve this thing tomorrow because it's been there. So let's step back and look at it as if it's one of those phenomena. And I think it's quite an interesting conversation that you bring to the table from the various perspectives. So I want to open for comments, questions, start with Mohammed, then I have Simon, and a question. Yes, I'll go here, there, come back, and then go there.
So I think
there's going to be a mic that is coming for recording purposes.
Thank you very much. So I want to start with a question to Leah. I mean, what you mentioned early in your remarks, Leah, was this notion of hospitality and all of those kinds of things, right? If you just look at the title for a second, we're talking about community support as well, right? So there's the other side of the equation here that is often underappreciated, the role of people who are not moving, who are also impacted in many ways, right? You also are part of a research initiative at a university. What is it that we need to understand of the communities that have been there, that are seeing people go through them or come and integrate? And I want to push myself as well, because oftentimes the conversation is on the people who are on the move, but not necessarily people whose lives are impacted, whether the hospital lines change, or whether the fact that they have new people that they've never seen before. And I'm not trying to sort of reinforce one idea or the other. I'm just trying to think about how do we navigate this question of people who are providing support, who are the local community, and what is it that we don't know? And so it's a very broad question, so take it as you see, but I'm very interested in that question. And I think there are other, so maybe we're combining various questions, or are we doing it?
Do we want to take 3 and then you can respond? So yes, Simon.
Senator, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the presentations. I have 2 questions. The first one has to do with regional organizations in Africa, which has been raised. The second one has to do with traditional authority. The first is, I know something about CEMAC. CEMAC is in Central Africa on the eastern side. It has 5, 6 countries. Let me try and give you them. They are Chad, they are the Central African Republic, they're Gabon, they're Cameroon, they are the Republic of Congo, not the DRC, and they are Equatorial Guinea. This regional body, number one, has the same general language everybody speaks, which is French. Secondly, it has, and this has been recent, it has developed its own currency, so they're only one currency. Number 3, all members of those five countries are able to cross borders without visas. And then thirdly, and I have a doctoral student who's written on this, and I'm afraid I can't tell you what I should be able to tell you. There is an agreement that any members of countries within CEMAC who are refugees, and there are many refugees from the Central African Republic, are to be treated as equal to the citizens in the other countries. And I'm not certain in how far that has a gender side to it, and it's an interesting question. So the first point I would like to make, which I think has already been implied, is that insofar as you have this kind of setup, has this made a difference to the ways in which migration has taken place within those regions compared to other regions? And the other obvious comparison is SADC, and clearly SADC doesn't have those same. That's my first question. My second question is, I'm recently reading a book which is very widely said to be interesting, which is called How Africa Works by Studwell, and I've finished the chapter, which is a long chapter, on agriculture, and he doesn't raise the issue at all of traditional authority. And that's what I'd like to ask here. Nobody has mentioned traditional authority. Let me give a very short anecdote, if I may, Edward. In 2015, when we had xenophobic riots in Durban and in Johannesburg in particular, the then Zulu king said, we don't want to have these people here, in Zulu, to a very large Zulu-speaking audience on the radio. This time, the Zulu king, the new Zulu king, has tried to do, as has our president, a kind of let's try and balance things. And I think that is a very important change. If it's going to work is another question. But it's a very important change in terms of traditional authority. If one goes into I know something about Kinshasa. Kinshasa is not just a city. Kinshasa is a province. And you have traditional authorities moving into the province from elsewhere, not only in the DRC, but also across the border. And the question so there have been positives and negatives. There would certainly be an important question if one is looking at migration of a seasonal nature into agriculture in West Africa. Because that would be into areas within which traditional authorities play a role. So my simple question is, in how far has traditional authority become important? And
Sure.
That addresses the gender issue as well. Thank you.
Thank you. We take this, quick one, then we'll come to you, and then we have a response. Then we'll go for another round.
It's also a mix of question and comment. I hope that's okay. I'll be as quick as possible. So on, I think the idea of sanctuary cities and municipal solidarity is extremely interesting. But of course we know that political mandates become a real challenge, where we see migration issues really at the national level, and cities don't often have the mandate or the competencies or capacity to work on migration issues. So if you could reflect on how do we bolster cities when this persistent challenge exists, but also from a political economy perspective, their budgets, their access to financing, what can we even hope that they achieve beyond infrastructure and services? And you mentioned city solidarity, but what about city-to-city solidarity? So in the national climate that we're seeing here, how can cities join voices to raise anti-xenophobia issues? But since we're talking about corridors, what about cities on migration routes? Is there value in them coming together, if you could reflect on that? Then on women on the move, I mean, just to echo your findings, what we see on the eastern route from the Horn of Africa to the Gulf is that women actually exist on very gendered and parallel migration routes that involve flights and not as much these risky overland and oversea journeys, but they nevertheless fall into irregularity, especially around the issues of documentation that you raised, because they have to first turn to smugglers to access authorized channels. So if you could reflect on whether there are other contexts where we see specifically women migration routes, because they're not necessarily moving in the same geographic spaces, and what can we learn from that? And then on your recommendations, just to add, I think a lot of the information that's given to women is the risks. We're constantly telling them that their journeys are dangerous, but responses and policy actors don't provide information about what to do when things go wrong. And so thinking also what information that women meaningfully need to make their journeys safer. Thank you.
Thank you. We take the last one in this route, just over here, and then we respond.
Thank you very much, Chair. My name is Dr. Theodore Kamwimbi. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Transformative Regulation of Work at UWC. My question is a simple one. Are we making an impact with the research that we are conducting? Why am I asking this question? Because a lot has been done, including by myself. Let me give you an example. When I was working with Project Abroad, Human Rights Office, which I was managing, just in the middle of xenophobic attacks in 2008, we even published an article in Canada with my interns who came from Canada, US, Australia, and so on. We managed to go into Parliament, the South African Parliament. We spoke about this. We invited the UNHCR at our office. They even agreed to work with me and my team for third country resettlement of the victims, which we managed to do. Canada, Australia, US, New Zealand, I think Norway, they took some of the victims because we helped. And in addition to that, of course, before that work, I worked with UCT, the Center for Popular Memory, where I conducted research with migrants living in Cape Town. So all this has been published, quite a lot, including what we've done with Prof. Marius. But are we making an impact, considering what is going right now? My son, who is just 13 years old, asked me the question yesterday, Dad, do you think your work is being heard? Look where we are right now.
Right.
I was quite embarrassed. That is my question, my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You're lucky that the young man didn't say, why are you even doing what you're doing? And so you say it's the simplest question, but I think it's the hardest question. Are we making an impact? And perhaps even extending that to asking the question, do we even know what has been done? Have we taken stock of what has been done to then begin from there? Or it's always about now there's a crisis, it's like it's starting afresh. So we should thank you, San, for the comment that is made. Can I ask responses from colleagues on the issues that have been raised? Who wants to start?
Well, thank you for those comments. I just have a few things to say. So first of all, I just wanted to come back to your comment about the role of people who are not moving also being important. And I think that that's really, really important. I think so much research, like my work, looks at the migrants and doesn't look at the experiences of host communities, of people who are not on the move, who are impacted. And I think that, it's in some way that's the root of so much of the anger that we see today and so much of the trouble that we see today is because we haven't been looking at that side of the picture. And I don't want to play into that and reinforce that. But I do think that it's really important to look at the experiences of communities who are affected by the passage of people and who are affected by the arrival of people. To put it in my lens, which is the gender lens, I think that there's a tremendous gender lens to that. I mean, just a few we saw a few years ago with the mass migration to Europe, issues of sexual violence in Europe by migrants, which caused a huge amount of anger, therefore reinforcing anti-migrant feelings. Interesting. I'd love to read the research that you've been working on about that. I don't have any other examples to give. I would love to read that. I think that that's fascinating. I think more than parallel routes, a lot of the work that I've done has looked at the way that women fare differently in the same routes. You know what I mean? So on the same path, women will sit on different places in a boat and have different experiences. They'll have different experiences of public transport. So the work that I've come across uses the same routes, but the women live in those routes differently, experience those routes differently, and often in ways which cause gender-specific risks for women and higher chances of death, higher chances of exploitation. And then I think the other comment you made about the need for information for women on what to do when things go wrong. You said there's information out there about the risks, but there's not information about what to do. And I think you're right, but what makes it more difficult is that often there isn't what to do when things go wrong. In order to pass women clean information about what to do when things go wrong, you need those services to be up and running. You need places to send them. And at the moment, services for female migrants or for migrants about what to do when things go wrong are so erratic in many places. It's very hard to kind of cleanly provide information for them on what to do, because it's like the chicken and the egg. What needs to happen first is that those sorts of services need to be properly developed. And so, reinforcing what you say, I think you're absolutely right, but I think the deeper problem is the lack of services before we even get to the information about those services.
Yep.
Thank you. Just very briefly, our colleagues speaking on the regional organizations, the CMAC experience is a very special one. I could say the same of the Great Lakes constellation. It's also a very special one. And then thirdly, the Indian Ocean Council. These are smaller, sub-regional constellations, and they work better than the bigger RECs. The problem with the RECs, the regional economic communities, of course, the overlapping membership is one problem that we have. The second is that some countries move at a different pace than other countries in the particular RECs. And that's where you find a political resistance, and we mentioned SADC. But I must say, from a broader perspective, what developments we see in the EAC and partly in ECOWAS actually, I think, set a kind of a more positive turn as to where we can go and sometimes even IGAD. But there are other problems. Now, thank you. On the traditional authorities, absolutely, you are quite right. I didn't mention this, but I had in mind that not just local government, but also the traditional governance structures need to be involved, if I could use the word, both in terms of migration to, but in particular also migration from. I'm currently assisting one of the governments in the continent on developing guidelines for bilateral labor migration arrangements. And in the consultations I've had thus far, this is one of the critical issues that came out. Okay, briefly on Mohammed's question on the people who are not moving, we see it in the general context, women who stay behind, and their additional burden and the issues relating to their support. And some good work in the continent has been done, also research-wise, on that. But we have to understand that when people move in Africa, still largely they move on the basis of what I would call a community contract or a household contract. And they just moved. They're expected to go and not just work, but to, for example, send back remittances. That's a whole fascinating area which we haven't discussed until now, but the area of remittances and the role thereof, but also the challenges. Africa is the corridor, from broader perspective, corridor with the most expensive remittance channels in the world, in the whole world, actually. And then finally, on the research impact, Theodore. Integrating the evidence base into their programs and their policies. It's an extremely difficult discussion, but we have to have that discussion. That interaction is absolutely critical in this continent for migrants. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have, oh, you haven't. Okay.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you for those really important questions. I'm going to try to just bring them all together for the sake of time. So first of all, when we're discussing impact, it's nice to see you. You know, this is something that we've been discussing also within MICA with our colleagues at UWC and elsewhere. And I think one of the problems that we all know we have in academia is that we're constantly underfunded. We're looking for different projects. I know that Faisal and I often talk about this, how, you know, the way that our research around migration, how we want to have our autonomy in the way that we do it. And so there's often competition also, and even our own universities just want us to publish as many things as possible. And so engaged research, which I know that you are very interested in, this kind of participatory research takes longer and it's less valued. But unfortunately, I mean, for the university, so one thing that I think we need to do in terms of impact is to encourage these kinds of collaborations and see again where we can do more kinds of participatory work and engage with multiple stakeholders. And so one research project that I'm doing, but I haven't started yet, is actually looking at these different areas which I discussed around municipal, civic, and activist groups in the city. It's very hard to do research when you're always, you know, buried in other things, but I would love to continue the conversation here about how we can work together to try to see what's happening in the urban spaces. But one thing about your comment, I just want to reject this idea that cities don't have the capacity. I mean, I think this argument is often used. I'm not saying you were saying that, but I think this argument is often used, and it's also when people try to define what is xenophobia, they'll say, oh, it's a competition over resources or jobs, and the cities don't have the capacity. But I mean, I just want us to try to go beyond that and see, well, what can the cities do? And I actually don't have the answer to what you said. I would love if there was more kinds of, you know, city networks, and maybe that's something that we need to discuss in the African context. Again, not to replicate the European context, but, you know, Europe does have different kinds of city networks for sanctuary. And then the last thing that I think you had asked about the impact on the people who are not moving. And I think one way also to get around that, and I was thinking about some of the work that the NGO Scalabrini is doing, is this idea of like demigrantizing our research, because often these issues affect everybody in the city or in the community. And even like birth registration or issues in home affairs, there's a lot of South Africans who also need these services and they're not getting them. So finding ways to find common concerns that can, bridge these gaps rather than always focusing on the figure of the migrant, that becomes a kind of, this kind of figure that we're always trying to analyze or think about, whether it's within our own selves or our own research. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's interesting to know that there is actually an association of African cities that is associated also with the African Union. And through that, every year there is a competition of what is the best city in Africa. So I'm not sure how that best city is done. So whether they are coming to this in competition or in collaboration. So that's something that is interesting. I think you also raise an issue that also speaks now broadly to the migration corridors. We tend to look on the ground. There is a very significant migration corridor that has developed over the last 15 or so years in the air. And if you've been traveling through African airports, you can't imagine the amount of young women that are going, especially to the Middle East and to other places. In each of these major airports, there are more than 4 plane loads that go every day. And it's something that we haven't actually looked at. And it's also interesting that it's only women. I saw this last time in December going to Stockholm and, Cape Town, Addis, Alanda, there were these loads of young women that were going somewhere. And I think that's another route that we should, I think it's the 6th route of the 5 African major migration corridors. So perhaps that's something that we need to reflect on. So I see that now it's time for tea break, coffee break. Let's continue the conversation and then come back to the second panel. Thank you very, very much.
session. And if colleagues who, Ayla and Faisal and Chenna and other colleagues who were supposed to come, I think. And we're missing Faisal, who was coming. All right. So, you know, the morning session was absolutely fantastic. And I got to sort of take notes and think about it, and I hope we'll continue with that. Now we're going to take a slightly different track, but again, on the similar kinds of approaches, people who are bringing different diverse perspectives, who are going to share both their knowledge and ideas on the role of technology. And here I hope that, I often push back when people associate technology only with digital technology, right? Access to a vaccine is also access to a technology. Access to a diagnostic is also an access to a technology. It is not to say that AI is not important. It is to say that AI is not the only technology that shapes the lives and experiences of migrants. So I hope we can really talk about access to technology in a broader sense. The second, my request to my colleagues is that, as we saw from the previous session, the conversation with the panel amongst themselves as well as with the rest of the group is the richest part of it. So if possible, keep your comments to the extent that you think is appropriate, short, and then hopefully we'll have more time for Q&A as well. The last thing I would say is, you know, I've already sort of gotten comments from people for what to do next year and all of that, and that is just absolutely wonderful. So please continue with those ideas moving forward. Like the last panel, we'll start from one corner. Faisal, will start with you. Please introduce yourself, your work, your background, your training, or whatever you want to share, and sort of we'll just go from that. So over to you, Faisal. Yeah, please go. We'll start with you.
Okay. So greetings and thank you for the invitation. It's always nice to be back here. My name is Faisal Garba. I work at the University of Cape Town, but also at the Africa Institute Sharjah. So people always ask me, what is that? So the Africa Institute Sharjah is located in a small Emirates, 10 minutes drive from Dubai. So basically looking at relations between Africa and the Gulf. I work mainly on migration and mobility, but my main interest is really inequality. So migration and mobility.
In Africa, Egypt, and Yemen office. The Mixed Migration Center is a research institution that sits within a humanitarian and development organization. So our work is very practice-based, and that's the perspective I'm coming from. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Maureen Achien, and I am a lecturer here at the Stellenbosch University, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Department of Information Science. My background is on social informatics, and my research primarily focuses on ICT4D and human-computer interaction. And I like the variation you gave about technology being viewed as from one perspective. And my response to the question is going to be coming from those three main fields: social informatics, ICT4D, and human-computer interaction.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Uchenno Keja. I am primarily affiliated to Nelson Mandela University. I teach philosophy. I'm a Nigerian. So I'm looking forward to our conversations today. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. So my input will try and touch on the questions that were asked in terms of how current landscapes of technology and migration, impacts questions of health, including questions of health technology, impact the broader migration dynamic, and how people on the move perceive and navigate these technologies, and what are the present legal and human rights issues, and also the question of kind of regulatory and legal challenges that need some attention. So I want to begin with some basics, right, which is that the bulk of African migration is within Africa. It's really important to state that. The bulk of African migrants move within Africa. And in some sub-regions, like West Africa, it's an excess of 72% kind of sub-regional mobility. Now, when you talk of refugees, it's actually much more. The bulk of African refugees are in Africa. So that if one wants to think of African migration, it has to begin from the continent. But the technologies that people use and the technologies of control, both in terms of the discursive dimension, but also the material dimension, are globally impacted. This is what I mean. Now, over the past few years, Africa has served as a testing ground for a number of technologies of control, piloted mainly by the European Union and individual countries within the bloc. Now, I'll come to that subsequently, but I want to begin with a different framing. So when I was growing up as a kid, I had family members living across West Africa and Western Europe. And the idea of the cassette player was so crucial in keeping in touch with those family members, right? So you kind of, as kids, you record, you tell your uncle, your aunties how you're doing, how your grades are, and the next football jersey that you want from Dortmund or Bayern Munich. So that technology as a medium of keeping in touch, of migrants sharing their conditions, but also their aspirations, has always been crucial in mobility on the continent. And so when the mobile phone, well, initially the landline, so what would happen is that, somebody living in, in Lagos or in Maputo or in Frankfurt, will place a call to a mobile number in the area. Often is some emerging lower middle class person who has, a mobile phone in lower middle class and working class communities. And so people would then go and call, the member of a family that has been sought after. And then you move to something called call centers. Your call center is this space where people go to make a call, or you go to book an appointment, to receive a call, right? And of course, the mobile phone, in a sense, shifted one, information around migration routes, but also the ability of migrants and those, I don't like this term, the left behind, as they call them in the literature, to keep in touch. But also forms of solidarity. Leah was talking about solidarity earlier. So technologies like the mobile phone and all these kind of social media tools have actually been crucial in how migrants share their experiences, find out ways of regularizing themselves, seek justice, but also create a sense of community. So over the past 3 years, I've been working with African migrants in the Gulf, and the mobile phone has been crucial as a mode of counseling for many people, of sharing experience, of feeling a certain sense of bond with people that are in similar experiences. But also, activist groups have used technology to know the circumstance of people, to build communities of support, just as researchers, conduct interviews with people. I know a researcher who's done some work with people in Saudi Arabia. To create e-mobility, to control mobility, and to map, track, and control people's trajectories. So the collection of biodata is not a simple technical exercise. It's a biopolitical exercise. where you collect information about people, and on that basis you can predict whether they are likely to move or not, and actually track their movement. Now, there was a very egregious example of this recently in the border between Mauritania and Senegal. So some colleagues found out that the European Union had actually piloted a particular technology on that border that downloads every single information on your mobile phone when you cross the border. Of course, you cannot do that in Europe because there are data protection instruments that prevent that. But in the name of avoiding trafficking, of avoiding smuggling, you are able to practice. So in a sense, what we are seeing is the unleashing of military-grade technology around borders on the African continent, and unfortunately, often with the complicity of African states. And unfortunately, I have to say this, with the, I have to be very careful here, with the inadvertent complicity of humanitarian organizations that actually want to do good, want to take care of people. Information is therefore important, but in the process, this is what we are seeing. So a colleague, Amanda Bisson and Rukayat Usman, have done this work, which is part of a book chapter in a book that I'm editing with another colleague around contemporary migration in Africa, around how biodata is weaponized, both in terms of creating internal borders within Africa, but also, you know, the European Union has this thing called the externalization policy, which is you expand the borders of the European Union into Africa in order to prevent Africans from going to Europe. So people are detained in camps, you know, in countries on the Sahel. So recently there was a case where people were detained in Burkina Faso because they walked like potential migrants, whatever that means, right? So you have this really ridiculous approaches, but they're very consequential on the lives of people, so that you have this zone of exception where protections do not apply to certain people on the basis that they are likely to be immigrants. So I think one thing, and then I'll try and round up. So what we're seeing is that this idea of monitoring reduces individuals to objects of control, and then challenges the very conception of migrant rights as human beings. So in a sense, people's rights are not just curtailed, but even the ability for them to live the full expression of humanness is reduced. And I think for research and activism, this has a number of implications. One is to take seriously some of the agreements that African states are signing that on the face of it have nothing to do with mobility and technology, but in reality enable all kinds of practices to happen. So you know the recent thing with DR Congo and Zambia and the US around this access to health data. Now that is also expanding to different parts of West Africa. So it's not just access to health data, it's broad demographic data. And in that part, you also have a heavy influence on the mobility side of things. And unfortunately, some of these organizations like IOM and so on that really, I think, intend to do good, but they are part of this architecture of control, which comes from a particular logic that certain people belong to certain places, right? So they moving from one place to the other is a problem. That keep shifting. So yes, we have to deal with the immediate, but we cannot deal with the immediate outside of the broad. So asking basic fundamental questions. And finally, this relates to the crisis that we face in terms of funding, because we all respond to funding calls that have been framed in particular narrow ways, that limit our ability to do independent, grounded, basic research. And I think for activists and humanitarian organizations, the question really is to ask ourselves, what agendas do we play into inadvertently? And I think this is really crucial. I have seen that in this country where a xenophobic attack happens, UNHCR and some other really well-meaning agencies go into the community, they gather the refugees in a hall and then give them hampers. Those refugees go back to the community, another round begins, because you've isolated them from the broad landscape of inequality of dispossession and struggles that they're ordinarily part of, whether I struggle for housing, for healthcare, and then you select them as a special category of humanitarian intervention, right? So you actually create the condition for further attack instead of understanding the whole rounded picture that drives the process. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think my presentation is going to try and really build on this by taking a slightly different perspective and responding to the second question that was given to us, which is how are people on the move perceiving technologies, navigating these technologies. And MMC's work really focuses on micro-level data, so interviews directly with people on the move crossing an international border. So I'll explore how they're using technology in their migration decision-making and how it features along their journeys. And I think what we tend to see, I think, in broader policy debates is that at least in my sphere, technology questions are often reduced to access. Do people have access to technology or not? And we see quite simplistic technology narratives. And what is missing is the same kind of in-depth framing that we apply to a lot of our research questions, like who or what is the technology being used for? I mean, we started to discuss that already today. So the utility of the migrant versus the utility of the government is completely different. Reliability, so the accuracy of data, the trustworthiness of information. And so creating a more multidimensional framework in how we think about technology and then situating it in time and space, which I know researchers tend to say, but really whether one is accessing technology at one's place of origin versus in more remote places of transit also then shifts. And how are they keeping in mind their norms and aspirations along the way? So. The data, so I'm taking a much more quantitative approach and also just descriptive, because these are really responding to the questions that we were shared. So the office that I preside over, we, since 2019, have collected about 16,000 surveys. So when the questions came through, I was exploring what have we learned from this broader survey called FORMI that we have, which tries to understand the 360 degrees of people's movements, their aspirations, their routes, their interactions with smugglers. So I looked into people's sources of information, their channels of information, because technology is not used in a vacuum, it's used for something, the utility aspect. So I think if we can learn that context, then we can better situate technology's use, where people are receiving information from. So that's my point of departure. And to make sure I keep advancing these, yeah. So I think what we've learned is that, well, first, pre-departure information is really lacking. I mean, I think this also goes for the previous panel when we think about women on the move and what they have access to. And we look at direct contact and not, research online as being the primary channel for receiving information by people. So when we asked this 16,000 people, did you obtain information about your route, your destination, your risks before the journey, still half of the people that we interviewed had not. So it's only half that are accessing information, and usually it's through their social networks. But some are using technology, whether it's phone calls, social media, and websites, although you really see this drop off quite precipitously as people go onward. So I think we also have to be quite humble about how technology is being used. And we know, I mean, this is very well established in the literature that personal connection are the dominant sources of information pre-departure, and official sources are the least tapped into. So when governments talk about using information campaigns online, sometimes these technological sources that are abstracted from social networks are the least useful or the least credible for people. And so how can we use technology through communities, I think, is the question that we should be asking. So, I mean, again, you've got sources here. I'm not going to read the data out loud also for the sake of time. And I think when we talk about technology narratives, we hear a lot at the policy level that people are getting exposed to ideas on social media, that migration is being glorified. But actually, when we look at the data, that might be true, but it's not often influencing people's decision to move. Again, it still comes down to friends and family in another country or in places of departure, so the information is not but then once people depart, the information landscape changes. It's not static. So during the journey, we see that, again, half of people say that they have access to information, and they become now even more reliant on people and less able to tap into online resources, or when you see phone call here, I think that really refers to calling people at home and abroad to access information. And so here, I think, is where also people tend to become more vulnerable and reliant on other migrants or smugglers for information, or members of local communities. And we ask people, what were your sources of information? So here you see that before, smugglers were really low on the list, and now they've jumped up, as have other migrants, as I said before. Since so many of us are researchers, I hope it's not too graph heavy. And then we take for granted also phone access. So we ask people, did you have access to a functional phone during their movement? Now again, this is people originating from East and the Horn of Africa, so we have to remember that. But 42% said no. Some said yes, but without internet access. So this is, a basic Nokia phone, and just about under a third said that they had access to a smartphone. And it was to stay in touch with family, a way of keeping safe, to get information about the journey, money transfers. So we can see how technology is actually, or mobile phones in particular, are actually being used. Now okay, so here, where I want to get into issues of reliability and trustworthiness. So we asked people, of all the sources of information, what has been the most reliable? And I think the key messages that comes out here is that family and friends are the most reliable sources of information. They will tell you when information is still risky, but in qualitative work that we've carried out, smugglers, for instance, are much less trusted. But you see here, we ask a bunch of questions about how people perceive their smuggler. And I think what's interesting here is that they're perceiving their smuggler as intentionally misleading them, but helping them to achieve their migration goal. So you see trustworthiness, but you also see utility featuring in contrast, but simultaneously. And I think this, even though it diverges a little bit from the topic, helps us understand these different features of information access and how technologies can be used. So this is my last slide, and I think it fits nicely to what we had just been talking about. We asked people what information would have been the most useful that you didn't receive. And I think a lot of the information campaigns, at least that we see in Nairobi and in the Horn of Africa, are about how risky the journey is, but not specifics about risk. Not where are the most riskiest locations, what are the actual conditions that you're going to be facing, how do you keep safe along the route, how long will the journey take you? Because we know that points of strandedness is a real issue for people on the move. What the real costs of the journey are going to be. I mean, only 13% of people say that they had all the information that they needed. So there really is a major information asymmetry, and that's something that technology could help, but it also could be used for misinformation or disinformation if we're being more cynical. And it potentially could play a role. I mean, I know it might seem stereotypical to say, you know, if you had known the risks, would you have taken the journey? It's a kind of notoriously unreliable question, but still, I mean, we do ask it, and it suggests, at least, if we can just be extremely cautious, that there is information out there that would at least make an impact about how people are making decisions about their movement at a minimum. So I hope that this information can help us situate how we think about digital technologies. Thanks.
Okay, so I want to add on to what my previous colleagues have spoken about, but from a slightly different angle. And coming from a background of social informatics, ICT4D, and human-computer interaction, I want to perhaps ask a different question in terms of moving away from answering the question, how emerging technologies shape migration, to asking, who are these technologies designed for, and whose experience count in their design? And one of the things that, you know, has emerged from the first panel, and now again, you know, listening to my previous colleagues, is that lived-in experience. And the technology is designed for, not used and accessed, the design of those technologies. And the first colleague did mention that in the African context, we are used as guinea pigs in terms of technology, where technology is brought in to get tested, to pilot, and then all that is taken back and brought back, and we are consumers of technology. We never design our own technologies for use. So that question, who are these technologies designed for, and whose experience counts in their design, is very important for me. So working across those three fields in terms of social informatics, ICT4D, and human-computer interaction, migration corridor in terms of ICT4D becomes the context that we need to understand in terms of the people who find themselves within those corridors. And the other thing that also emerged earlier in the panel was the people who don't move, or the traditional authorities that were mentioned. Do we actually take them into consideration when we talk about designing technologies for the migrants? Do we take into consideration their lived-in experiences? And those lived-in experiences, do they inform the design, the use of the data that is being collected, and eventually, what is the impact of that to the people who we expect to use those technologies? So for me, that's what interested me in that question. You know, do these technologies shape migration? It's obvious, yes, they do. They do shape the migration. But the broader question, before we even ask that, is the design process. How do we design? Like, you know, somebody mentioned earlier, they're used for surveillance. So if the design is for surveillance, then that means that the people we expect those technologies to be used with, they don't know that they're actually being surveilled, because their lived-in experiences were not taken into consideration. So the other question that we were asked to reflect on was the current landscape in terms of technology within the migration corridors. And I orient my response to that question again from a design perspective, because that is where all technologies begin from. You design, you develop, you put it out there for use. So design for me is very important, and in terms of how we understand the people who make use of those questions. So from a human-computer interaction standpoint is not whether mobile technologies or any type of technologies actually are present within the migration corridors. It is important to understand the interaction design of these platforms and accommodate the condition under which migrants make use of those technologies, and also the infrastructural that is available for them to make use of those technologies, because we cannot expect or assume, come with our own assumptions about how those technologies are going to be used. Because if migrants are constantly on the move and we don't take into consideration about the context where they find themselves. I was just finding about that the 6th migration corridor on the air. Do we ever think about technology being used in the air? I don't think we focus so much on that. So for me, the question about design becomes very critical in understanding how the people who find themselves in contexts that are resource constrained, in contexts that are fragile in terms of movement and in terms of availability in infrastructure is very important to understand, and how that inform the design and development of the technologies we put out there for migrants or for anybody in a society context. I don't want to repeat what has already been said, because I think much of what I wanted to talk about border surveillance is going to be a duplicate. And one of the things that I as I was hearing a lot of the conversations in the first panel, that came to mind about the data that is being collected in communities, the data that is being collected about migrants on the move. Who has access to that data and who owns that data? So one of the topics, the major topics in the information science or the social informatics field right now is digital sovereignty. And in terms of how data is being collected about migrants and shared with whoever, and we don't have access to that. And majority of countries in this context don't own the rights of the data that we produce. And that's one of the biggest gaps in terms of technology use, regardless of the context, whether it's in the migration corridors or whether it's in just communities at large, organizations. We find ourselves, especially in the age of AI right now, where everybody is so worried about data being used to train AI. But we are not really thinking about developing our own AIs with our own data so that we can be able to have ownership of that, because we are so reliant on technology that comes from elsewhere. So data sovereignty is a big thing for us right now in the information systems world, and we try to find a way of contextualizing that in terms of how do we, in our own contexts, whether it's within the migration corridor, how do we make data in ownership something that everybody understands? As a migrant, if I move from point A to point B and I leave my data or the digital footprint, who has access to that? And as a migrant, do I have the right to access that data? So in terms of how emerging technologies is shaping the migration corridors, it's a very tricky question to provide a clear answer to, because we still don't understand all the components that form the outcome of these technologies. Because it can be well and good to have a technology that surveils people, for good or for bad. But at the end of the day, whoever you're surveilling, do they understand that if I give my data to this organization, what right do I have with it? Right? So we see a lot of that, being used, across countries, now where people, if immigration use your historical data, in terms of your social media platform and the digital data or footprints that you have, and they use that decision or with that history of your digital footprint to deny you access, whether it's to the country, whether it's to access to services. And that is it's part of what, that digital sovereignty complexity that we actually don't get to understand the rights we give away when we use certain technologies. And it boils back down to my point where, how do we design those technologies for who and what experience counts when they design them? So I think I'll stop there so that my other colleague can also cover.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to be sure that I know how to operate this thing. Good morning once more. It is quite interesting that this particular panel, everybody has got some technology or the other. Thank you again for the invitation to speak here. I'm only a philosopher, and that means that part of what I do is to in this particular part of the world. Because migration is like some of those global problems that will always be with us. But the immigrant has a particular sort of way of being in the world. And this way of being in the world, from a philosophical perspective, we can characterize as a phenomenology of existence. How is that produced? This is what I want to try to get to in my brief reflection here, which would be long and would be sufficiently boring. So, okay, now, let me begin by noting that, it is really crucial to understand how the changes in global economic situation also relates to the political imagination of migration, the political imagination of technological advancements, and many other aspects of life. If we can say with Tupov that instead of labor, surveillance capitalism, which is the modern form of capitalism we are experiencing, feeds on every aspect of every human's experience, why not migration too? So how does technology do this? This is the question. So when you look, there are different, and of course, not to repeat what has been said, but if people were money, they would have greater freedom to move. We see that we don't really have problem with the movement of food. I mean, in Stellenbosch here, you can get all kinds of cuisines, Italian, Mediterranean, and so forth. So maybe food is even freer than human beings today. But this brings us to the question of power. How is power constituted through the use of technology in relation to migration? This seems to me to be one of the crucial issues, the fundamental issue that philosophy has to think about and help to clarify, because implicated in the discussion is lack of clarity about conceptual transformations. The transformation of the concepts through which, as you know, Immanuel Kant said that concepts are the windows through which we see the world. If there is conceptual transformation and we don't understand how it is producing new reality, then we will not be able to respond adequately to the new reality that is being produced. So it is not a question of power to begin with. Migration. There are two types of migration that is currently being produced or reproduced through the use of technology. And these two types of migration are, one, migration from powerful countries to everywhere in the world, but especially to less advanced countries, and migration, two, from powerless countries to anywhere at all. These two types of migration are powerfully being reproduced through the use of technology, the creation of technologies of surveillance and so forth. And we can see this when we look at the particular type of technological products that are associated with migration. Drones. I tried to use the technical term. I don't know if I got it. Yeah, surveillance cameras, video analytics, biometrics, which Faisal has talked about, radar sensors and all that. And to understand why power is implicated here, we just have to look at who the owners of these technological products are, the names behind the products. Yeah, you can see Bosch, NEC Corporation is a multi-trillion yen corporation, multi-billion-dollar corporation, not to talk about Airbus and so on and so forth. What does this mean? This means that a lot is at stake for these companies in terms of the deployment of these technologies, in terms of the way that they lobby governments to continue to use these technologies to produce specific ways of relating politically to other countries and also politically to individuals that are either their own citizens, because when you control borders, you don't control just people that seek to come in. You also control your own citizens in different ways. There are people who love other people from other countries. For instance, when you control the movement of people into your country, that might mean that they will not have their loved ones with them. So you are controlling your own citizens. Countries have borders of police and the military, and military people have guns. You see power also being displayed there. But when you look critically at the owners of some of these products, you see how powerful they are because they are richer than many governments in Africa combined. So now, instead of trying to say or repeat what my colleagues have said, because you know that you are coming to the panel when everyone is saying, like my colleagues have already said. There is very little you can say because, as Kant said, thought has a definite shape, and there is only very little you can do, logically. But, you see, let us perhaps look at how not to think about emerging technologies in relation to migration, instead of jumping into how to think about them. We often operate with this linear logic that says, there is this problem about migration, here is the solution, or we should try to solve the problem. But migration is a human experience, and it is a global experience, just like climate change or public health. It will continue to evolve, and you cannot just operate with this linear logic that it tries to pick out one aspect and say, this is the solution. So if we are going to learn how to think, or understand how not to think about migration, we have to understand the differences between linear logic driven by problem-solution approach and logical complexity that is able to handle difficult questions like climate change, global public health problems, and so on and so forth. The second thing is that we tend to think that the use of technology in relation to migration, the development of new technologies to govern migration, is all about efficiency. But efficiency is not an absolute value. You can be efficient, but unjust. So we need to understand the limits of efficiency and what that means for the kind of ethical foundations we imagine for the governance of not just technologies of migration control, but also technologies of improvement of the relationship between people within specific borders and people all over the world. Then we tend to think that even countries that have no need of some of these technologies want to catch up, because how can you be modern if your systems are archaic? So we want to catch up. Sometimes neighborhood effect can lead to some of these imaginations that are really very problematic. Another way not to think, we shouldn't be thinking about the relationship between emerging technologies and migration is to think that technology is evil. You know, some liberals, so-called, would say, you know, yeah, human dignity trumps everything. We can't even think about technology. This is dehumanizing people. Come on now. We want to be able to control the things we can control, but do them in ways that humanize. So that is another way we shouldn't be thinking about this. And all these discussions, sometimes I don't understand it. Tech colonialism, digital authoritarianism, sometimes we don't know what they mean, but these are conversations out there, and I think that, you know, they repeat the same old patterns of thinking, which is that the West is evil and we are the good people. But we are the good people and we're still very poor, producing a lot of immigrants. So we need to deal with that. So let me try to conclude by looking at the reality that what really should count. Like I said, I can only try to do the philosophical aspect. How to think should come or should be given priority over what to think. So we should be asking critical questions. One, what kind of technical expertise is at play in the development of new technologies of migration control? What kind of expertise are we developing? People in academia in order for us to find a way. And what do they mean, you know, for our political imagination of human beings and society? You know, because in the end, you can have efficient societies, very well-developed, built-up societies, but not societies that are fit for human beings. What new reality is being created and why does it matter? I gave the example once that, you know, even things like political parties, liberation movements, are not just what we imagine them to be. The ANC in South Africa, for instance, is not just a political party, if you think about it philosophically. It is an image of the world. And once that comes to an end and you don't have a replacement for it, you have a situation of conceptual disorientation. So the question is, with the development of all these new technologies of efficient border control, what new reality are we creating? What are the old realities we are displacing, so to speak? What are the ideological, conceptual possibilities we are foregoing by prizing certain other ways of looking at the fundamental principles that should guide us in the creation of these technologies? Which basic values should count? Freedom, justice? Because in the end, you know, societies don't become free because they produce the enormous technological advancement or machines. It is ideology that made society. Africa, the greatest achievement today in Africa is political freedom. This didn't come about because Africans became leaders in technological products and so forth, but because of ideology. So when you displace ideologies with these new technologies, what are you doing? So, and now, absolutely, I promise you this is the last slide. So, I think for me, the basic question is this: how can we ensure that technology remains in service of freedom? And here I don't just mean human freedom, I mean freedom, both for human beings, for all the constituents of the environment, our ecological system, and so on and so forth. I'm sorry, I think I spoke longer than was expected, but thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You know, this is fantastic and very, very thought-provoking, all four of my colleagues. I want to start with a little sort of anecdote. About 15 years ago or so, there was this whole notion of migration crisis in Europe. And my Egyptian colleague said, whose crisis and for whom, right? I mean, why is the term migration crisis used from the perspective of Europeans? If you ask the person who's leaving, there is no migration crisis. That person is just trying to find safety from war or economic collapse or persecution, right? This notion of migration being a problem is a certain structural concept that assumes that somebody is determining what the problem is and somebody else is a problem for that group, right? So this notion of migration crisis in and of itself tells you of a certain framing of that. And I think the same kinds of things can go with technology as well. Wonderful things. I mean, I'm just going to sort of capture some of the ideas from Vessel, this notion of certain people belong to certain places. And that is also time bound, right? Now, somebody who came to this country in 1800s now somehow belongs, but if I were to ask that question in 1860s, that person doesn't belong here, right? So this notion of temporality is, I think, an important one. Of course, this notion that Ayla brought up is an important one, that our conversation ends just with access, not with sort of appropriate ways in which we ensure that they're able to use it. Just because somebody has a cell phone doesn't mean that their problems are all resolved. And the data is actually really remarkable that 42% don't even have a cell phone, right? This notion that it is universal, and you know, in my field, in engineering, people think that technology is this great democratizer, and all of that kind of just nonsense is pervasive. Then we, of course, heard about who owns data, how do we ensure that? One of the questions that some of my colleagues have asked is that imagine that I am migrating from several different countries and my data is stolen. Which court do I go to? Which court has jurisdiction? And what rights do I have to say that my personal information was stolen? And how do we navigate those kinds of questions as well? And of course, this last presentation of efficiency, which is the new buzzword in AI, right? It is to produce things faster. It is to do that. But is it just, right? Efficiency is not inherently an idea that brings justice. Then that notion in and of itself is actually interesting, is that if you're sitting in the US and you're looking at the world from the US-centric view, freedom means something very different than somebody who happens to be in Lebanon today, of what freedom is and who's to decide. So I think these are really wonderful concepts, and I can spend a long time on that. So I'll sort of open it up to questions from the audience. We have about, I would say, 15 minutes or so. And we'll start with Leah in the back. So we'll collect 3 questions maybe at a time. So we'll start with Leah in the back, our colleague here, and then one more as well, please.
Okay, thank you, everyone. A really, really fascinating discussion. I just wanted to bring another angle that I think we might need to be looking at when it comes to surveillance and the way that technology is used. And you know, invoking Foucault, for example, you know, this panopticon and the way that governments work. But I'm kind of thinking about the way in which technology and this digital online presence has affected the way migrants conduct themselves and the way that their freedom, if technology is supposed to be freedom, and people migrate for freedom or aspirations, whenever they're in the host country, they're no longer able to become a new person, or they're no longer able to express themselves, or they have, in the remittance literature, these financial obligations, so they can't really show themselves in those particular ways. So how technology is actually constraining migrants within their own communities. They're being almost surveilled within their own, you know, community networks about how they must, you know, behave and you know, show themselves online. But then a counter to that, thinking about, you know, we always want to think about migrant agency. And so I'm wondering if anyone has been doing research on how people then actively recurate their online presence, which is not actually, I mean, we all curate an online presence, but how they actively create some kind of online world, which is maybe not their exact reality, but because they need to show their realities in a certain way. And one more small question. Ayla, your presentation was so interesting for me as a qualitative researcher. I'm always so excited to see the quantitative. I just wanted to ask a question about your methodology. You know, when you were asking questions about some of the questions where there were so many answers around, you know, how they've used it. Was this, they had to fill in a certain response, or were they able to actively provide answers around, you know, how, some of these questions? Because that might affect what their responses might have been. Thanks.
Thank you. I have a question. I have a question and a comment. Question is for you, Professor Garba. How do you reconcile this method of treating immigrants who are in immediate danger? You said we need to look at the long term, but then sometimes NGOs create a humanitarian crisis by isolating these people who are in immediate danger. So how do you reconcile the two? Because they're in immediate danger, and in some cases, it is actually people who voluntarily go to these safety centers. It's not that they're actually taken there by NGOs. So how do we look at saving them immediately, but then also looking at the long-term aspect? And then my last comment now is, I expected the audience to probably speak about what is currently happening in South Africa at the moment. On Sunday, the president gave this address to the nation in which he said they are now going to move these vetting processes to the border, where immigrants will be processed from the border, and then those who are not eligible will be ejected. I mean, obviously it is based on this myopic logic that people who come to South Africa come from around Southern Africa. So I expected that to be talked about, but yeah, maybe someone will comment on that.
One more question? Yeah, great, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. My question is actually addressed to all the panelists. Do you think that the use of technology is being used as an obstacle to migration? Let me clarify by using an example. I was watching on one of the American TV channels where an immigration lawyer was saying, if you are traveling to the US currently, you need to make sure that everything that you are saying online is in compliance with the laws. Because at the interviews, they will probably tell you that you said something online which we are not going to accept. And there is a gentleman who is a journalist in the DRC who has been sent back to Congo as he was landing in Canada. He made a statement regarding a politician whose family is based in Canada. So they said, we are not going to accept you in. And the immigration officer just showed him on his phone, do you recognize the statement you made? He said, yes, that is part of my job. Then he said, we are not going to allow you in. So do you think to be limited is going to make the world concerned in terms of the future as far as immigration is concerned? Thank you.
So any of the panelists can take any of the three questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Really important and thoughtful question. So, Leah, yes, people curate different kinds of presences online because you're dealing with different audiences. There are people back home, who expect certain things of the Ethiopian guy living in South Africa. So if you even think of how weddings happen among the Ethiopian community, just to take that example, and pictures that you snap next to a Ferrari and so on, but also you use different kinds of identities and names, right? In certain moments, so there are people who have 4 Facebook accounts, because you really want to be careful about what you put out there and where you even circulate. Who knows this Facebook account? Who knows you with this alias and so on. So people do those things, and it's actually an old practice. I mean, if you think of the early West African immigrants to say Germany and the Netherlands, right? It wasn't Facebook or anything, but it's about the name you appear with in different public spheres. whether it's to the state or to the African community, the Ghanaian community, people from your village, and so on. Okay, now, this point is really important, right? Because, you know, humanitarian organizations, NGOs, deal with concrete issues, right? Life and death issues, you know. I work with some of them. Africa Unite, for example, in Cape Town, we work closely together. So I personally don't just sit in my office. I do a lot of work in communities. I do popular education. For example, in Kailicha, I've done work on social determinants of health. But through that, you then feel struggles. What is the relationship between that and access to housing? What is the relationship between that and structural adjustment in Africa and the uprooting of people, the doing away with social welfare across the continent? So it's about the different entry points so that, yes, we are dealing with a concrete issue of attacks and so on, but then what is the background story? And what are the meeting points between the conditions of those people who think that the guy selling chips on the streets is the reason why they're unemployed, and then the condition of the guy selling the chip? And so for example, we've done this work that led to an initiative in PE, Hermanus, George, and East London, where we established something called resource corners. These are spaces that we establish in townships where young people who are locals and migrants come together to just talk about their issues, their aspirations, the difficult questions. Now, out of that, we then wrote a children's book on migration. So basically where we use the product of a research that we conducted between 2019 and 2024, targeted at children, at young people. You know, how do people move? What are their circumstances? And can you find yourself in them? So basically what I'm saying is that you have to deal with immediate concrete situations. But if you stop there, this is the danger. If you stop there, it becomes a self-perpetuating thing, right? You're always on the edge. And also, you deal with this as a separate category. The guy selling chips on the street is very much linked to some granny, you know, who is struggling to pay her bills because the 350 grant is not enough as a result of de-investment, you know, defunding of the public sector and so on. So really it's about this dealing with the concrete and the broad, you know, because if we do one without the other, then we can also be detached and say, oh, let's analyze the circumstance without doing anything about it, right? So we can also just be blinded by dealing with the immediate. And finally, this question around technology and as a solution. Look, there's something called the Pan-African Forum on Migration, which is an African Union thing, you know. The last one was held here in Cape Town. Guess what the theme is?
Border management.
Smart borders, right? So it's interesting. This is an African Union organ. Now, let me give you this background. The African Union has the AfCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is presumably supposed to be the tool that unblocks the continent and undo this ridiculous reality, which is African states trade more with, you know, external parties than they do with each other. It doesn't matter how incredibly connected the value chain is in terms of what happens on the ground. So such that the bulk of trade on the continent is actually facilitated by itinerant small-scale traders, the majority of whom are women. So almost every country on the continent has signed up to the AfCFTA. Now, the AfCFTA is supposed to then be facilitated by the Protocol on Free Movement. But guess what? Only 4 countries have signed and ratified the protocol. And which 4 countries? Sao Tome and Principe, Niger, Mali, and Rwanda. Right? So this idea is that you have this counter movement. On the one hand, they speak around integration and so on, but in practice, they are doing everything to prevent integration. So how do you have an African Union thing about smart borders? I mean, what does that mean? I studied in Germany. I used to just go to Holland to buy something, and I have no idea I've crossed the border, right? Because it's a seamless thing. Now, before the Schengen area was put in place, ECOWAS was already in place. So this idea of a free movement was already there on the continent. But now you have a complete undoing of that. You know, and where is this coming from? I promise to end here. Where is this coming from? This is part of what we see, which is this convergence of policy around migration between the EU and the AU. The AU through European Union, but also individual European countries through your GISs and so on, actually sit on the table of policy making on the continent. so that you have a situation whereby policies here, including the national migration legislations, are not reflective of realities on the ground, of historical connections and our political economies, but are simply vehicles, of ensuring that you have hard borders, because the more difficult it is for somebody to move from Burkina Faso all the way to Morocco, then it becomes harder for them to get to Europe. So that's the logic. And African states through the AU simply adopt this without any critical thinking. Thank you.
Thanks so much also for the questions. Just to follow this point, I had the ability to be at both PAFOM in December and also the EU version, ICMPD's Border Management Conference. And the way that technology was discussed was completely different. So in Europe, it was about using AI for training without having to be on the ground and bringing in the latest technology. For border management. And here in Cape Town, the discussions were around using technology to manage migration for continental circularity and sort of maximizing trade, a sort of really different framing of similar issues. But I think the critique is really what we and how do we think that is likely to impact labor migration and movements and work and labor markets. And that's something we haven't had the chance to touch on our panel, but it's something I think we should invest time thinking about, and of course continental circularity. Going back to the first question from Leah, we also had the pleasure of having this really cool project run last year and continuing this year, a participatory qualitative research project with 10 to 15 LGBTQI organizations focused on refugee and migrant issues that are based in Kenya. And at least those coming from Uganda talked about using their digital footprints to create online identities that were more in line with how they saw themselves and not how they interacted with people in everyday life. And it was how they first interacted with queer spaces in Nairobi and saw their communities. And this was largely the case for Ugandans, but also Sudanese and Ethiopians, and impacted their decision to move to Nairobi. So I think these places are spaces of belonging, but also understanding where your communities can also exist in real life. And on this issue of ownership. So this same group of organizations, they're now creating their own data collection system to own data, to produce their own narrative. Because what we often see is that they're going to meetings with UN agencies and governments, and their experiences are often framed as anecdotal or testimonial and not as data, because it's not quantitative. And yet they service hundreds of beneficiaries, of members of their own communities. So if they walk into a meeting and can harness that, it somehow takes on greater power and can directly confront the figures that official sources are touting. So having community-led data, migrant-driven data, I think is really important. And your question on how we survey, so our enumerators are often refugees and migrants themselves who've worked with us for a number of years, and the questions are unprompted. So they've been trained to hear what people are saying and then take note of what they think is the best fit. And if something is systematically coming in as other, which is always an option, then we take the decision of whether to add to our survey. And then finally, technology being used as a barrier to migration. I wanted to add one point to this, other than the social media, like scanning our social media with it, I think is crucial. But I also think that where barriers exist in legal migration processes, we see a space created for smugglers and brokers. So I think more research should be done on how smugglers feature in regular migration processes. And we talked about it on the previous panel, that when particularly women have gaps in their access to documentation, or there's gaps in how we interpret authorized migration pathways, then these middlemen come in charging fees, often sometimes not with the right information, and insert themselves in such processes. And so I think that's something worth investigating. Thank you.
Okay, so from my point of view, just listening to how people, respond and the responses that are being provided, it reinforces my questions in terms of whose experiences are these technologies designed for, and who the technology is designed for. Because, from border surveillance or digital curation, are those technologies actually really designed for for our context? They're never designed for our contexts. So if you do digital curation, you have a Facebook page, you have right now, I know in 20 years' time, if I want to visit the US, it's going to be an issue. So all of a sudden, I have to think about my digital footprint 20 years back. What did I say about a certain president, right? And will that be, and it's being used now. I don't know if you guys have read about the Somalia referee that posted something on Twitter, then it was Twitter, now it's X, about some Department of Home Affairs, the US consulate in Somalia. And now that is being used against him. So it does answer your question, yes. The technology that we have is being used as an obstacle for migration. And in this case, it's not even just burst migration. It's traveling and gaining entry and access to certain things. So from a social informatics point of view, and that's where I'll always reference my responses and human-computer interaction. How do people interact and engage with technology? And do they know the consequences of that? And I don't think we do in our context. We are happy about the TikToks, we are happy about the Facebook, we are happy about the Instagrams. But we forget about how that is used to surveil what we do and the consequences of that. The other thing that I think should also be talked about is those who don't have access to technology entirely, those who don't have digital footprint entirely, and those people exist. And those people they are within the migration corridors. And sometimes you find people in those positions still being disadvantaged in terms of, let's say, AI being used to look at the profiles of individuals and using that to exclude certain individuals because of the characteristics that have been fed into these systems. So the assumption that a certain person from this region of the country is automatically a security risk without actually looking at whether they are truly somebody who poses security risk or even have a digital footprint to begin with. So that for me is still a very important issue for us to understand from a very foundation of how these technologies are designed and developed.
Okay, I think I'm just going to respond to one thing because of time, probably. And that is the question regarding why we didn't talk about the current historical moment in the country. I think that is a very important thing. But let me begin by observing that I am a Nigerian, for instance. Part of what it means to be a Nigerian is that nobody likes us. And we also don't like ourselves. So, but seriously, you have to think critically sometimes about what is important to respond to, what is efficient, and what is not. You know, I think the crucial thing is that most of these abuses of technology in terms of creating certain opinions or pushing certain narratives, they depend on two things. One is that there is already the foundation for such through which such things operate. Algorithms of oppression already exist. How are we to respond to that, and what are the principles behind the creation of such algorithms? The second thing we need to understand is that sometimes we forget about human nature. That human nature is built on vulnerability and also on care, love, and those sentiments, but also that the opposite is possible. And that does not mean that human beings are condemned to, to be helpless and to repeat evil and do all this kind. But being aware of how human nature operates would help us to respond positively to these things. So, yeah, let me stop there. I know that there will be opportunities for us to engage further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate the conversation, the input. One of the things that I would love to do is if we can have a group photo right before lunch, and then there's lunch, and then there's sort of conversation between our invited colleagues. But again, thank you so much. You know, when I had originally discussed this with Julia and Edward, there was a concern that this may become too focused on one particular technology, but you've sort of proved me wrong, and I am glad you did, and was sort of diverse and rich and intellectually very, very engaged. So thank you so much.
And before we go for the photo, as I mentioned, that last year STIAS celebrated 25 years of existence, and the former fellows, the board member, everybody arm twisted two individuals, the founding director of the Institute and the sitting director of the Institute, to write a book about the evolution of a creative space, but working from the position of the experiences of STIAS. So I think it made my 2024 one of the toughest year, because I had to dig into the fellows that have been here since the establishment, but more to think about how do we establish creative spaces, and just taking some examples from STIAS. So I would like to offer that book to all of you that have come to have this conversation. So I don't know whether those books, let me just have, so this is the book, and we were fortunate to have a grant for publishing this book, so we can give it for free. That is always a big challenge with some of these things. So each one of you is welcome to pick a book, but for those of you, maybe you are coming from institutions as well, you might pick a second book for the library. So please welcome to this. And we sneaked in the building of STIAS and the new wing. And that note, I think during lunchtime, for those of you that want to just have a quick tour of the facility, just let my colleagues know and we can show you around the STIAS facilities. But on the final note is that when I look at all of you, I'm looking at applications for fellowship. Thank you.